Kamla. My guest today is Tony Misch. He's the director of Lick Observatory Historical Collections project. Lick Observatory is one of the oldest observatories in Western USA, and all this while I thought was located in San Jose, but turns out it is not part of San Jose, but is part of?
It's near San Jose. San Jose is the nearest large city, but it is part of unincorporated Santa Clara County.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
How did you get incorporated? You're an artist. You trained as an artist, bachelor's and master's. Mm-hmm. How did you get incorporated in this world of astronomy?
Well, it's a long story, which I will try to make short. But I was in graduate school in Los Angeles, and I had grown up in Seattle, and I'd gone to Los Angeles to grad school. There was a painting competition in the school, and I entered some paintings, and as it turns out, I won, and I won a small cash prize of $75. And I took it to Sears and bought a pair of binoculars because I wanted to look at the sky. I mean, like most kids, I had a fascination with astronomy when I was young, which had been somewhat sidetracked when I went into art, but I thought this is a good time to revive it. So I started going up on my roof in LA and looking at the few stars that you could actually see in that highly light-polluted environment. The binoculars helped, and I relearned the constellations, and it reawakened my interest in astronomy enough so that I overcame my then innate shyness. And
shy?
Believe it or not, yes. Yeah,
okay, so
very shy. Yeah,
really?
Timid, but I did call a friend, a brother of a dear friend who was a real astronomer. He was on the staff at the Mount Wilson Observatory,
which is in
outside of Los Angeles.
Is
somewhat
it in
the same situation as Lick is to San Jose. Mount Wilson is to Pasadena. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And Tom Jabal, who was the astronomer, said, "Tony, it's great to hear from you. Come on up to the mountain." So my now wife and I went up and spent the night and helped Tom with his observations on the 100-inch telescope. And I went away smitten and wanted very, very much to have something to do with astronomy. And to my surprise, Tom managed to find me a job about a year later with Mount Wilson Observatory on a National Geographic grant to come and live on the mountain for 6 months and work on a project that monitored a particular property in stars, where I would work 21 nights a month and then have 10 nights off and so on for 6 months. And I thought, wow, what an opportunity. I can't let this go. I'll do this for 6 months. Then I'll go back to pursuing my ambition, along with all my contemporaries, of being an art star and getting a great job at a university or whatever, and becoming rich and famous, or at least famous. But instead, the 6 months at Mount Wilson turned into 6 years there, and then that led to the job at Lick Observatory for another 20.
So this Lick Observatory that we see if you drive down 101, mm-hmm. Any of the highways in Silicon Valley,
right.
You see this white dome peeking
mm-hmm.
out from behind whatever, the trees or whatever. Why was it established there? And did it play an important role?
It's played, well, yeah, it plays and continues to play a very important role. It was established, it was founded in 1888, and really the first major contribution that it made was to be established on a mountaintop. It was the first permanently sited large research telescope on a mountain in the world. And
before that, where would they be?
Typically in maybe on the estate of a wealthy amateur who had a telescope, or on a university campus. But it was not, the condition of the sky above the telescope was generally not taken into account for sighting the telescope until Lick Observatory. And it was known that certain conditions, and particularly on mountaintops, lent themselves to clear, steady skies where images were crisper and better focused than in other locations, and also there was less ambient light around. And it is to the great credit of the planners of Lick Observatory that they decided to undertake the really vast engineering that was needed at that time in 1888 to put a big science establishment on the top of a 4,000-foot mountain. It had, in fact, no road even leading up to it when it was first built.
So they had to...
They built the road. That was the first.
Oh. Yeah. Do you think Randolph Hearst was influenced by the way the observatory was built in building his little thing in San Simeon?
That I don't know.
It just popped because San Simeon, the same thing, right?
There have been, for instance, the Carnegies were very much involved in observatory building not long after Lick Observatory was established. They, in fact, built Mount Wilson. So, yeah, it is. Hearst, I don't know.
In terms of building, because it's not too far from where we are.
Right.
That's why I think. Right. So that was the first contribution, that it's the first observatory built on.
It's worth noting, too, that virtually every observatory since then and still now builds in remote, dark, high locations. So Lick really was the template for the modern observatory. This
was made possible by a well-known rich gentleman from Silicon Valley, or what was known as Valley of Hearts Delight.
I won't go into the whole Lick story because it would take too much time, but he was a very interesting and eccentric, he was actually an Easterner, eccentric man who had spent decades in South America and brought the small fortune that he accumulated there to San Francisco. He sailed in to San Francisco Bay, I think in January of 1848, and just before gold was discovered, and had begun investing his small fortune in land. And then, boom, of course, the whole California economy skyrocketed with the discovery of gold, and Lick was left a wealthy man. And towards the end of his life in the 1870s, the early 1870s, he was casting about what to do to memorialize himself. He wanted very much to have a memorial to himself, and among other things, he proposed colossal statuary for what's now Golden Gate Park, overlooking the ocean. Somebody said, no, it would be too tempting a target in a naval warfare. That wouldn't be a good one. So he changed his mind. He said, I'll build a pyramid in downtown San Francisco, larger than anything, larger than Cheops, to hold my remains. And then he was persuaded, several people have taken the credit for it historically, but I think it was George Davidson, who was then the president of the California Academy of Sciences, who persuaded him that to memorialize himself, the best thing he could do would be to build the world's largest telescope.
So he kind of put that bug in his ear.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he built this. How long was it under construction?
Lick signed the final deed of trust in 1876. I think he was on his deathbed at the time, and it was finished in 1888. So a dozen years.
A dozen years.
Yeah,
because he had to haul everything up.
They had to haul everything up. Though some of the resources, the brick, the clay was on the mountain, but there were delays. There were legal delays and there were technical delays.
So there is apparently the Lick Mill Mansion the Lick Mansion is on Lick Mill Road.
That's right.
In Santa Clara, which parallels Great America Parkway, which is where Intel is located. So that was where he lived, and I'm assuming because you can see the mountains, he probably saw what was happening.
Yeah, I think, no, he unfortunately didn't. He died before any of the construction.
But he knew where it was going to be built.
He did know where it was, yeah. And by that time, in any case, he was living in San Francisco, infirm after a stroke. So.
Oh, so he had left Santa Clara.
Yeah, but I think that one of the things that persuaded him to choose Mount Hamilton was that it was visible from his homestead, yeah.
And that question just came up. I was thinking, oh, wait a minute, the Lick Mansion is there, so he probably was able to see. One of the interesting things that the observatory has done is now part of UC system? Okay.
Has been since its founding, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
Lick, the Board of Trust had been instructed in the original deed to turn it over to the University of California on completion. So they've managed it ever since.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is the role of women astronomers... What can you shed light on the secret figures that went up that mountain?
Yeah, well, I think that
or the hidden figures.
The University of California has been particularly progressive in the the acceptance of women in astronomy. And two examples are Lick's first female PhDs, which were in the reckoning of American astronomy very early. They were Estelle Glancy and Phoebe Waterman, who both received PhDs in 1912. And whether they were the first PhDs granted to women in the U.S. in astronomy, I don't know, but I think they must have been among the very earliest.
What can you tell us about Estelle Glancy?
Oh, well, Estelle is a real favorite of mine because she not only received a PhD, she was mathematically very gifted. She broke another very, very important ceiling in
a glass ceiling.
A glass ceiling in astronomy. She actually went to the observatory and made her own observations. Traditionally, women had been employed in astronomy as what they then called computers, and their job was to do the analysis of the photographic plates that in those days were the stock and trade of astronomical research. And they would do the measuring of the plates, and they would do the computations and so forth, but they weren't allowed to touch the telescopes. They weren't allowed. Yeah, they weren't allowed to.
Why?
I don't know. I think it was partly it was a men's club. It was partly the weight of the inertia of tradition. I think that observatories like Lick, which are on mountaintops, which are remote, necessarily the astronomers stay there at least part-time while they're making their observations, and all of the facilities were made with men in mind. And so the men objected when the idea that women might do observations came up. They said, well, where are we going to put them? You know, they'll be very uncomfortable here. This is too rough for them and so forth. And
she wouldn't take no for an answer.
She would have none of that. And she went and she made, in the summer of 1908, beginning in actually the fall, and beginning in September 1908 through December, she made an exquisite series of glass plate, 8x10
What is a
photographs.
glass plate?
In those days, the photographic emulsions, the film, were mostly on glass rather than film strips as we know it. Astronomers continued to use glass for years because it's very stable. But Estelle made these 8x10 glass plate photographs of Comet Morehouse during its entire apparition from September to December. They're just beautiful. They're just beautiful.
So she had an eye.
She did, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Now, she didn't continue being an astronomer.
She didn't. She did for a short time, but she was received an offer from the American Optical Company and became a very important lens designer, which takes quite a lot of mathematical oomph to do that kind of work. And she has, I think, almost a dozen patents to her name.
So she broke another glass ceiling.
Yes, she did indeed. Yeah.
So is she the one that we should credit for that little thing that they have where they measure when you go to get your glasses?
No, I don't think she invented that, but she may have improved on it.
She may have improved on it.
Yeah, I don't know.
So I'm assuming, but she did progressive lenses.
Yes, she worked, I think, on progressive lenses.
So we should credit her.
She was working in the lens design, the mathematical curves that refract the light in just the right way. Yeah.
So isn't it amazing that we don't know much about this hidden figure?
No, we don't. Yeah,
and that she,
interestingly.
And we all wear glasses, and there's a little bit of her embedded in our lens, right?
Actually, you pointed this out to me, and that you found in an article that she's known among opticians as the first lady of optics, which I thought was lovely. Yeah,
yeah, it's nice that she's getting credit. Now, Phoebe Waterman eventually became Haas, and Haas was a very famous business family.
Right. Yeah, though Phoebe married into the family, and actually what happened with Phoebe, who also got her PhD the same year, 1912, I think was a pattern that persisted for a long time, not just in astronomy, but in all professions, where women were highly trained, but once they married, there was no question of them continuing with the profession that they had chosen. They became wives.
So
that was Phoebe's fate, but at least
that's the path she took.
Yeah.
But her name lives on in the Smithsonian.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I only learned that in looking some things up for this interview, that her son became extremely wealthy and underwrote a wing at the Smithsonian, which is now named for her.
Yeah. So Rom Haas or Rom Haas is the
I
company.
don't know. You know more about it than I do.
Because I was intrigued that how come we don't know about her. So when I went and dug around, I found out that the Rom Haas is a very famous company, and they went and bought Morton salt.
Yeah.
So they've done all sorts of things, so she had money. Okay, so these were the two women. Were there other women astronomers?
Yeah, there were, and I should say equally interesting and equally unknown. For example, Elizabeth Cummings, who worked at Lick in the early 1920s, just at the time that electronic instrumentation was beginning to come in. This was very revolutionary, and she built Lick's first photoelectric photometer, which is an instrument for measuring the intensity of starlight. But instead of by estimating it or visually or by measuring it on a photographic plate, it does so by turning the light into a current, a measurable current. So it's a more accurate way of measuring.
Elizabeth Cummings.
Yeah, Elizabeth Cummings and the photoelectric photometer. So that really that's another glass ceiling. I mean, instrument making was certainly something that women were not expected to do, but she jumped right in and. Yeah.
So there have been a fair amount of women.
Mary Lee Hager is another of the same time.
Who is
She eventually became the wife of one of Lick's directors. She became Mary Lee Shane. But before that, she did some very interesting work. She was a PhD in astronomy from UC, and she worked on something called the interstellar medium, a very, very rarefied near emptiness that lies between the stars, but it's not completely empty. And she was able to learn some fundamental things about that. But these people are not household names.
But they're all very inspirational.
Yeah.
When you hear their stories, they must have also surmounted a lot of challenges, lot of biases from the family and elsewhere, but they persisted. And so that's the message in your anecdotes.
I actually feel a particular closeness to Mary Lee Hager, who became Mary Lee Shane, because she was Lick's first archivist, and now I am very much involved in archival work there. It is thanks to her that most of the archival, the written, documented history of the building and operation of Lick Observatory survived. It was going to be tossed out in the 60s. And she said, no. And she actually took it all and brought it to her house and began organizing it. And eventually it became part of the special collections at the University of California, Santa Cruz Library, and is a place that I've spent a lot of time. So I owe her a particular debt.
Then there's also an interesting link to Albert Einstein. How did that come about? What's the backstory on that?
This comes about because of the tradition that Lick began in 1889, the year after it was built, to observe total solar eclipses. You'll remember we had one not long ago, and that came over America, and a lot of people went and saw it. Eclipses happen fairly frequently, about one and a half years or so on the average, but they're all over the world, and you have to be right along this narrow path to see them. So eclipse expeditions typically have to travel a great distance and set up in sometimes very remote locations in order to make the observations. But particularly in those days, astronomers could learn a great deal about the sun, its outer atmosphere, and by association, the stars, which are also suns, of course. So they went.
Is it because it's dark at that time and they can observe? Is that the reason?
It's because the sun, the disk that we see of the sun, of course, is observable any day any clear day.
Corona?
But there's a corona around it, which is much fainter and is of great astrophysical interest, but can't be seen, or at least in those days there was no instrumentation that could block out the disk so you could see the corona except the natural instrument of the moon going in front. So, and there were all sorts of scientific objectives that you could pursue at eclipse time. And one of them was suggested by Albert Einstein in about 1915 when he first published the final form of his theory of general relativity. And it predicted, among other things, that light would be bent in a gravitational field. So if you had a pencil beam of light going and there was something massive, it would be bent a little bit and go off slightly in a different direction. And he suggested that this be tested at total solar eclipses, because you can imagine during the day, during a normal day, the sun's there. You don't see any stars around it if it's much too bright. But knock out the middle bit, and the stars appear right around the sun. Right? So this is light that's passing near this massive gravitational body, the sun. And according to Einstein, those stars should look a little bit displaced because the light is getting bent, and we're seeing it over there instead of over there. And that was a test that was only possible to do at total solar eclipse and very difficult to do. And it was attempted first by Lick in 1914 in Russia at an eclipse. And
he had to abandon the equipment.
They had to abandon the equipment there. Boy, you've done your homework. I'm impressed. Yeah, because of the outbreak of the first World War while they were there. Plus, it was cloudy the entire time and they missed it. Again, they tried again in 1918 with very limited success, but never went to publication because the data weren't very good. And then in 1919, a British expedition led by Sir Arthur Eddington did manage to at least provisionally confirm this displacement of starlight by just the amount predicted by Einstein. But there were still a great many doubters, and the British data were not the best. And many people thought, no, this can't be. It needs corroboration. So W.W. Campbell, who was then the director of Lick Observatory, made it his aim to put this to rest once and for all. And he was actually not very thrilled by the general relativity. He would have probably preferred a classical universe. But to his credit, he went after it. And when in Australia in 1922 at an eclipse, Lick succeeded in returning a resounding corroboration of Einstein, Campbell was right there with it.
So you'll say, yay.
Yeah. So scientists don't always get what they want, but he got a wonderful result. And
so this is again, it was relegated to the footnote level. Campbell's. Well, it's not there in the general, as you would say, popular culture. Or popular...
No, it isn't. But within the eclipse and the general relativity.
Yes, within the niche it's known.
It's certainly very much there.
Yeah, within the niche it's known.
Yeah.
But here in Silicon Valley, we don't know that there's a direct connection between Einstein and the observatory. Yeah. That's what I'm getting at, Right. So this is, again, a hidden...
No, I see what you mean. It's a hidden treasure, really.
Yeah.
We have, and I hope someday to have them on display at the observatory, but in the archive we have the lenses that were used for those observations. And it's nice to think, in 1922, the light passed through this lens that proved the theory of relativity. So...
Well, then there is the personal element where you excavated something that was of great historical significance.
This again, thanks to Mary Lee Shane, because I was in the Mary Lee Shane archive at Santa Cruz, and I was actually doing research on the eclipse expeditions. And I just opened a drawer, and there, lying in the drawer, was a piece of paper, actually a piece of vellum.
What is vellum?
It's actually a sheepskin that's been pounded out into paper.
Sheepskin that's been pounded out.
Yeah.
And then that's what they write.
Right. That was one of the papers that was one of the writing surfaces that was commonly used in pre-printing, but also later. But certainly wasn't used in the 19th and 20th centuries, where most of the material in the archive originated. And so it immediately struck me that this is an old thing. And I took it out of the drawer. It was about this big. And it said on the top that it was made for somebody called Hans Hannibal Hutter von Hüttershoffen, who was an Austrian nobleman. And underneath it, though I didn't recognize it as such at first, was a horoscope. But there was a diagram with the signs of the zodiac scrawled around it. And then what I did understand was that written in the margin in a 19th century hand, it said in German that the top of this is in an unknown hand, the part beneath, namely the horoscope, is in the hand of Johannes Kepler. And then it was signed Otto Struve, who I knew had been in the 19th century the director of the Pulkowa Observatory, where most of Kepler's papers had ended up.
Where is that observatory?
It's in St. Petersburg.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you had discovered something of Kepler's.
Yes, it was in Kepler's hand, and it was not something of great scientific note. After all, it was a horoscope. But from the point of view of an artifact, it was quite wonderful to have something in my hand which was shaking by that time, which had been held and written on by Kepler. By Johannes Kepler.
How did you double check that it was actually
Well, there were two ways. The first thing I did is I called my uncle Bernard Rosenthal, who happens to have been a scholar and dealer in medieval manuscripts.
Where?
And first in New York, and then in recent years in Berkeley and San Francisco. And I read him the German, and I described the thing to him, and he said, "Wow, he said that sounds like a Kepler to me."
Your uncle endorsed it first, and then?
Then I made a color Xerox copy and sent it to a manuscript expert in Berlin that my uncle recommended, and he got back to me a couple of weeks later and said, "Congratulations, you have a Kepler."
So where is this Kepler manuscript?
It's now in the special collections at UC Santa Cruz.
And you're in charge of the historical collections.
Historical collections, and I should make it clear that the historical collections project that I started and run is up on Mount Hamilton.
Okay.
And it deals not with these manuscripts that Mary Lee Shane saved, but rather with the old instruments, the observers' logbooks. We have about 2,000 of them, and we have, I would say, probably 150,000 glass photographic plates.
150,000?
50,000, yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
wow. How does one go to the observatory?
Slowly.
Well, I believe it is,
Yeah.
it is what, 30, 25 miles with...
Well, it's 19 miles of winding
And how many
road.
hairpin bends?
Oh, they say 365.
What do you say?
I've never counted them. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, what was it like the first time you went? Were you...
Well, I had already grown accustomed to mountain roads living at Mount Wilson, even before my father was a geologist in the North Cascades. So we drove very hairy logging roads as a kid. In fact, before he would let us get driver's licenses, we had to drive them. So I was used to it. But I know a lot of people have a difficult time with that drive. But as long as you drive slowly...
So it's a very tight...
It's narrow in places, yeah.
It's narrow in places.
But we get lots of visitors. We get something like 30 or 35,000 visitors a year.
30 or 35. Okay.
And most of them survive.
Yeah. And it's just at the end of Silicon Valley.
Yeah. For those interested, there's a lot more information about visiting at the Lick Observatory website. Is it okay if I quote it?
Yeah.
It's www.ucolick.org.
Thank you for sharing that information.
Okay.
And thank you for stopping by and talking to us about all these hidden figures, the hidden gem in... does it count as Silicon Valley?
You can
It's in
count
Santa
it as
Clara.
such, yeah.
It is in Santa Clara County, isn't it?
It is in Santa Clara County, right.
Well, yes, it does count as Silicon Valley.
Yeah, okay, very
Thank
good.
you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. If you missed any of our shows, you can watch them on our website, kamlashow.com. Please join us next week for another new conversation. Until then, goodbye.